Hi, I'm Daniel Cunningham, CEO of Leonardo 24/7, and today we're going to talk about operational risk. There's actually a lot of risk in property management, probably more than people realize. I think what people think of automatically is they think of liability risk, and liability risk is things like slip and falls, pool accidents, playground equipment. These are things that will get you into a lawsuit if something goes wrong. But that can also include violating fair housing practices. Sexual harassment is a significant liability risk for any operator. Mishandling mold or lead paint remediation. There is a process that needs to be followed, that if it's not followed and somebody claims that they're ill, you have complete exposure, and can be massive exposure. Discriminatory employment practices are a significant piece of property operations these days. Property management is an industry that really involves a lot of people, especially when you consider like the margins and the revenue that comes from property management, really high personnel to revenue ratio. And so improper terminations, not paying overtime, not allowing people to take their breaks properly, like those sort of things are significant risk to a property management company. ADA violations, sometimes these are physical characteristics of the property that maybe were there when you bought the property, but there's an industry that is built around finding those non-conforming pieces of your property and litigating. You also have tenant law violations regarding evictions, deposits, notifications that are required surrounding hazardous materials that are on site. So yeah, there's a lot of things that fall into liability risk. But that's not all there is. You have property risk, things that can cause equipment breakdowns or property damage. Okay, so pruning trees, you need to make sure you're doing roof inspections, you need to make sure that you're doing water treatment. Think of all your preventative maintenance items. If these are not completed consistently and in the proper form and fashion, you can have equipment breakdowns, you can have water leaks at the property. And then there's operational risk, like items that negatively impact day-to-day operations and ultimately NOI. So if you're not billing residents move-out charges properly, if you're not posting available units online in a timely fashion, it happens. Unit goes vacant and it's not posted on, or Craigslist or whatever it is you're advertising your available units. Not raising rents on time at all or accurately. Maybe you're raising rents too much and it affects your occupancy, or you've not raised them enough and you're leaving some significant money on the table in terms of market rent. Not processing affordable housing applications properly or failing to document eligibility requirements, that's a significant source of operational risk. HUD can come back and reclaim monies that were allotted to the owner. Like if that goes wrong, it can cost the owner a lot of money. So you have operational risk items. You have reputational risk. So if you're a third-party management company and you don't do a good job, if you have equipment failures, if you have lawsuits because of the other items, then you get fired, right? That's operational risk. If you're the owner and you're the operator and you can't fire yourself, then poor operations, poor maintenance will result in bad reviews online. And potential residents are reading online reviews before they commit to any leases. And so that can kill your traffic. Bad employee reviews. If you're not clear with your expectations with people in the field, if they don't feel valued, then, you can get reviews on Glassdoor or Yelp that will discourage good people from coming to work for your company. So reputational risk is something people don't often think about. And then lastly, there's legal risk. So these are areas where you might actually be breaking the law by failing to comply with local codes. So most obvious consequence of that is you'll have fines, misdemeanors. In some cases, even criminal penalties can apply if you're not following the local codes. If you're not checking pool chemicals, if you don't have certified operators that have to be certified by the city or perhaps the county, if you're not performing fire inspections on time, not meeting heat and ventilation requirements in certain locations. Some places require you to check fire-rated penetrations on an annual basis. Some places require you to maintain the private property that abuts your property. I mean, there's a lot of esoteric things in the municipal codes, and at a minimum, you're exposed to fines. And if something happens at your property and they find out that you were not in compliance with the local codes that had to apply to that, then your ability to defend yourself starts to go down. And so the legal risk aspect of property operations, I think, is one of the things that's most often overlooked, because it's difficult. Who is reading municipal codes on a regular basis? Who can make their way through that? Who's watching to see if the codes can change? That's hard. It's one of the reasons I think that Leonardo 24/7 is really attractive to a number of our clients. It's because we can do all that stuff for them automatically. Our machine learning algorithm is reading municipal codes and finding those areas of the codes that apply to multifamily operators. And then we provide a feed of the things you need to be doing. And that mitigates legal risk. So if you want to try to manage risk, the first thing you have to do is you have to have a process. You have to have established a way and agreed upon a way that you're going to mitigate risk in the first place. It's not going to happen by itself. And it definitely should not be left up to whoever happens to be on site, whatever their own history and experience and knowledge is, should not be how you mitigate risk. You ought to formulate a process. And then the next thing you do is you need to make sure everyone follows that process. So it's one thing to have a binder on the shelf with all of your risk mitigation procedures outlined in that binder. But it's another thing to make sure that people are paying attention to it and are following the process when it needs to be done, in the right way, at the right time, throughout your portfolio. And that's where a lot of this breaks down. And it's where Leonardo 24/7 actually comes into play, because we have a way to provide consistency through a mobile application or the desktop application that provides guidance throughout the year for all of your risk management procedures. And it gives the procedure that needs to be followed, the form you need to fill out, the inspection you need to do, whatever those things are, come out automatically. So whether it's Leonardo or another tool, like, you need some way to make sure everybody is following that process. And then you need to take action when the process isn't followed. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with operators who have a procedure, have explained people, trained people how to do it. Perhaps they're even using Leonardo 24/7 to make sure that they're following procedures. And then the people in the field, for whatever reason, don't follow up. They don't do what they're supposed to be doing, and the operator kind of shrugs, and that sets off a chain of events that eventually can land you in trouble. Because if you're not willing to enforce your own policies and procedures, even if they seem nitpicky or not urgent, right? In the face of residents complaining about noisy dogs or having to evict people, like, that stuff, I get it, is urgent. But the other things, like risk management items that aren't so in your face, can still be important. And if they're dismissed when they're not followed, then you're just setting a precedent, and that's dangerous. So take action when a process isn't followed. And then lastly is to document. You need to demonstrate that you're doing all the things that I just mentioned in one way or another. If you do have an incident, if you do find yourself in court, then you have the paper trail that shows, here's what our process was, here's when we followed that process, here's the data that we collected. Again, this is where a tool like Leonardo 24/7 becomes critical, because that's what we do, is we dole out the correct procedure at the right time, and then make sure people are doing it, let you know if they're not, and then you can export all that data, your completion reports, your exception reports, what was missed, and you've got a record that you are doing, making best efforts to try to mitigate risk. Bad stuff will still happen. Even the bad things happen to the best operators. But it is infinitely worse to have bad stuff happen when you have no process, no procedures, no documentation. That's infinitely worse than having it happen when you've tried to mitigate risk, and that makes all the difference. So if you have established policies and procedures for mitigating property risk, and you want to be effective with that, one key component are inspections and checklists. There's a book I once read from Atul Gawande, who's a surgeon. He wrote a book called The Checklist Manifesto, which is I recommend it. But interesting is his focus was surgeons, right? What you expect would be the smartest, well-educated professionals in any field that you can imagine. And yet even surgeons benefited from a very simple checklist, pre-op checklist, with very simple things like, make sure you're operating on the right part of the body, make sure it's the right person. Like there was a pre-op checklist, and that simple checklist they were able to show could reduce post-op complications, post-op mortality by a significant amount. So if surgeons can benefit from a checklist, then certainly property operators can benefit as well in a number of ways. So first of all, a checklist provides accountability. If you have a process and you want to make sure people are following it, you put that in a checklist so that everybody has that same checklist and they're following it every time. So that gets your process established. That makes sure that your process is followed by everybody in the same way throughout your portfolio. But digital checklists are way better. So having a checklist is good. Having a digital checklist is way, 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 way better for a number of reasons. So now you can actually monitor completion real time if you're using a system like Leo. You can see who's completed what inspection, what data they captured. So that's important, having accountability, make sure that it's being done. And if you need to make any changes to those forms, if your process changes, if you're using paper forms, that's really hard. You got to republish to everybody and they got to swap out the old, swap in the new. If you're using a digital checklist, you can make the change at the admin level, and that change should propagate to all of the inspection forms being used throughout your organization. Digital forms allow you to inspect faster. You don't have to write everything down. You can have default answers for a number of things. At the end of it, you don't have to take the information out of your form and then enter it into Excel or some other database. Or if you're using Excel, you don't have to take it and transport it into some other usable format. So having a digital checklist helps there as well. You can collect and process data automatically. Now, this assumes that the checklist, the digital checklist that you're using, is backstopped, connected to a very robust database and reporting engine. Okay, if you're just using a checklist program, that's better than nothing at all. But if you're tied to a database that allows flexible reporting, well, now you can do all kinds of interesting things. You can report on any piece of data that you collect during the course of that inspection. You can export the results into Excel if you need it, or a nicely formatted PDF report where the photos are all nicely aligned. I mean, there's something about the presentation here. If you're a third-party management company and you're presenting the results of an inspection to a client, you don't want it to look messy. So you want to make sure that the digital checklist that you're using is tied to some kind of program that allows you to produce really great output. And it should allow for advanced features, such as collecting signatures. You may want to complete the inspection and have somebody sign off on that inspection and record that signature. You may want to be able to assign costs so that if somebody answers a certain question a certain way, like does the carpet need to be replaced, that you can associate a cost with that and then aggregate those costs, or maybe quantify those costs by category. So that's where digital checklists come in really handy. And you may, if you have a system like Leo, you might be able to do some other things that are pretty fancy. Based on the answers that are given in the inspection, you might be able to trigger an email to somebody, say, hey, look, I just did this inspection and we got an answer that you need to pay attention to. You may want to trigger a work order. Like you did the inspection and now you've got to do something else that needs to be tracked in your work order system. Or maybe you just need to trigger another task or a follow-on inspection as a result of that inspection. So digital checklists are better. Even better yet is a checklist that has all those kinds of features and capabilities. I'm Daniel Cunningham. Today we were talking about operational risk. If you'd like to learn more, please go to leonardo247.com and request a demo.